Connor Bedard just made a massive announcement. And if you're a Chicago Blackhawks fan, this could be the moment you've been waiting for. After years of rebuilding, years of patience, and years of hearing that better days were still ahead, Bedard is no longer talking about potential. He's talking about expectations. That's a very different conversation, and in my opinion, it's one that changes the way the entire hockey world should look at this franchise. The latest development comes just days after Bedard signed a 5-year, $75 million contract extension with the Blackhawks, a deal that officially cements him as the centerpiece of this organization for years to come. But what really caught my attention wasn't the contract itself, it was what Bedard said afterward. Instead of celebrating the payday or talking about personal milestones, his message was simple. The focus now is getting the Blackhawks back to the Stanley Cup playoffs. That might sound like a straightforward comment, but I think it carries much more weight than people realize. For the past several seasons, Chicago has been in full rebuilding mode. Everyone around the league understood that wins weren't the top priority. Developing young talent, collecting draft picks, and building for the future were the goals. Connor Bedard arrived as the first overall pick in 2023 with enormous expectations. But even then, most analysts believed it would take time before the Blackhawks could realistically compete again. Now, the tone has changed. Here's how I read this situation. Bedard isn't just saying he wants to make the playoffs someday. He's signaling that the standard inside the organization has shifted. The rebuilding phase is beginning to give way to the expectation of winning hockey games. And that's a significant change. When a franchise player signs a long-term extension, it often tells you as much about the team's direction as it does about the player. Chicago didn't simply commit to Connor Bedard, they committed to building a competitive roster around him. At the same time, Bedard committed to leading that next chapter. That's why this story matters. The 5-year contract carries an average annual value of $15 million, making Bedard one of the highest paid players in the National Hockey League. Some people immediately focused on the money, but my take is that the contract says something much bigger. The organization believes Bedard is already one of the league's elite talents, and they're willing to invest accordingly. At just 21 years old, that's remarkable. But here's another detail that deserves attention. The extension wasn't the maximum possible length under league rules. Instead of locking into an even longer deal, Bedard agreed to 5 years. Depending on how the salary cap evolves and where both the player and the franchise are later in the decade, that structure could provide flexibility for both sides. That's not unusual for star players, but it's another reminder that every decision around a franchise cornerstone has long-term implications. What stands out to me, though, is that Bedard didn't use this moment to make the story about himself. His comments were centered on the team. He talked about getting better. He talked about taking the next step, and he talked about playoff hockey. That tells me his mindset has already evolved from being the exciting young superstar into becoming the leader this organization needs. Leadership isn't always about wearing a letter on your jersey. Sometimes it's about setting expectations publicly. Once your franchise player says making the playoffs is the goal, everyone else inside that locker room hears it too. Veterans hear it, young prospects hear it, management hears it. The fans certainly hear it. Now comes the difficult part, actually delivering. And that's where things become especially interesting. When you look back at Bedard's production so far, it's easy to understand why expectations continue to rise. Despite playing on a rebuilding team, he's consistently produced offense against some of the league's toughest competition. He has already established himself as one of the NHL's brightest young stars, combining elite vision, outstanding hockey IQ, and a release that can beat goaltenders from almost anywhere in the offensive zone. His numbers reflect that progress. This past season, he recorded 30 goals and 45 assists for 75 points in just 69 games, continuing the upward trajectory many scouts predicted when he entered the league. Those aren't just impressive numbers for a young player. They're impressive numbers for anyone in today's NHL. And perhaps even more impressive is the context. Chicago hasn't exactly been loaded with elite offensive talent around him. Opposing teams know who the biggest threat is every night, yet Bedard continues to create scoring chances and produce at a high level. That's one reason many people believe his best seasons are still ahead. Now imagine what happens if the supporting cast improves. That's exactly what the Blackhawks have been trying to accomplish this offseason. General manager Kyle Davidson didn't sit back after extending Bedard. Chicago has continued adding pieces it believes can accelerate the rebuild. Players like Bowen Byram, Ian Cole, and Jordan Greenway bring experience, stability, and different skill sets to a roster that desperately needed more depth. None of those additions guarantees a playoff spot, but collectively they suggest the organization believes it's time to become more competitive. From my perspective, that's completely consistent with Bedard's public comments. Organizations don't hand out contracts like this while expecting to stay near the bottom of the standings. They expect progress, real progress. Of course, every rebuilding team reaches a point where expectations begin rising faster than results. That's one of the biggest challenges in professional sports. Fans become impatient. Players feel more pressure. Every losing streak suddenly attracts headlines that it might have ignored a year earlier. Chicago is entering that phase now. The excuses start disappearing, and Bedard seems perfectly comfortable with that. One thing I've always found interesting about elite athletes is how quickly they redefine success. Early in a career, simply making the league is enough. Then it's winning awards. Then it's becoming an all-star. Eventually, personal accomplishments stop being the priority. Winning becomes everything. That's exactly the impression I get from Bedard's latest comments. He's already accomplished plenty as an individual. Now he wants postseason hockey. But just as optimism around Chicago started building, another development complicated the picture. Because while the franchise now has its superstar locked into a long-term extension, there's one issue hanging over the beginning of next season that nobody inside the organization can ignore. Once you've reviewed this first block, I'll continue with the second approximately 900-word block, picking up with Bedard's injury, what it means for Chicago's playoff hopes, the Patrick Kane discussion, and where I think the Blackhawks are headed next. Because while the franchise now has its superstar locked into a long-term extension, there's one issue hanging over the beginning of next season that nobody inside the organization can ignore. Connor Bedard is recovering from shoulder surgery after suffering an injury during off-season training in Vancouver. Based on the information the team has shared, he's expected to miss roughly 4 months, which means he'll likely miss training camp and the opening stretch of the regular season. That immediately changes the conversation. Just a few days ago, everyone was talking about the contract extension and what it meant for the future. Now there's another question being asked across the league. Can the Blackhawks stay competitive until their franchise player returns? In my opinion, that's going to be one of the biggest storylines to watch early in the season. Every rebuilding team eventually reaches a point where it has to prove it can survive adversity. Injuries are part of hockey. Every contender deals with them. The difference is that established playoff teams usually have enough depth to weather the storm. Chicago is still trying to prove it has reached that level. Without Bedard in the lineup, somebody else has to create offense. Somebody else has to step into a leadership role. Somebody else has to help carry the pressure. That's why the off-season additions become even more important. Veteran players aren't only brought in for what they contribute on the ice. They're also there to stabilize the room when challenges inevitably appear. Players like Ian Cole bring years of NHL experience. Bowen Byram adds skill and mobility on the blue line. Jordan Greenway brings size and a physical presence that every team values over the course of an 82-game season. None of those players replaces Connor Bedard. Nobody can. But if Chicago wants to remain in the playoff conversation, contributions have to come from throughout the lineup instead of relying almost entirely on one superstar. Here's how I see it. This injury could actually become an early test of just how far this rebuild has come. If the Blackhawks can stay around .500 while Bedard recovers, they'll be in a position to make a serious push once he returns. But if they fall too far behind in the standings, climbing back into the playoff race becomes dramatically more difficult. We've seen that happen before across the NHL. Strong teams survive injuries. Developing teams often struggle under the same circumstances. That's why the opening months of this season may end up defining Chicago's year before Bedard even gets back on the ice. There's another storyline that's quietly gaining attention as well: Patrick Kane. Nothing has been announced, and there is no confirmed agreement. But after Bedard signed his extension, conversation around a possible reunion between Kane and the Blackhawks picked up once again. Bedard himself said the idea of Kane returning would be incredible. That comment immediately caught people's attention. For longtime Blackhawks fans, Patrick Kane isn't just another veteran free agent. He's one of the greatest players in franchise history. He helped deliver 3 Stanley Cup championships and created countless unforgettable moments wearing a Chicago sweater. So naturally, whenever his name becomes connected to the Blackhawks, fans start imagining what another chapter might look like. My take is that it's easy to understand why. Even if Kane is no longer the player he was during his MVP years, his experience, creativity, and knowledge of winning hockey could still provide value to a young roster learning how to compete. At the same time, the organization has to think beyond nostalgia. Every roster decision has to fit the long-term plan. Salary cap considerations matter. Health matters. The direction of the team matters. Bringing back a franchise legend simply because fans would love it isn't enough on its own. The front office has to believe the move improves the hockey team. So while the speculation continues, it's important to separate possibility from certainty. As of now, nothing has been officially announced. Still, it's another reason why all eyes remain on Chicago. When I step back and look at the bigger picture, I think this is one of the most fascinating rebuilds in the National Hockey League. For several years, everyone understood the timeline. Draft elite talent. Develop young players. Accumulate assets. Be patient. Now the conversation has changed. Patience is slowly being replaced by expectation. That's exactly what Connor Bedard's comments represent to me. He's no longer speaking like a young player hoping the future eventually arrives. He's speaking like someone who believes the future should start now.